I am filing this report under protest. Not protest in the political sense, I want to be precise, because precision is what the Varathy Cognitive Cartography Division requires. And I have spent 11 years giving this division exactly that. Protest in the professional sense. The ordinary categories on this form are not adequate to describe what happened during the Vorath Kalath Subject Assessment Project, and I am unwilling to compress the findings into a framework that was not built to hold them. I have submitted a supplementary notation to that effect. I expect the Council will read this report, read the notation, read the raw stage logs, and then sit quietly for a while before deciding what to say. That is what I did. I am giving them the courtesy of warning. The project was my design. I want that stated clearly. Because the Council will be tempted to locate the problem somewhere in the protocol, and I am telling them now that the protocol was not the problem. The protocol was excellent. It was the most refined version of the Varathy 12-stage cognitive cartography battery that our division has ever fielded, adapted over the course of 8 standard research cycles from an original framework designed by Senior Coordinator Hevrath Oren at the founding of Comparative Cognition Institute. I have run it, in various iterations, on 34 subject populations across 9 species categories. I know what it produces. I know what the data looks like. I know how to read it. I could not read this data, not at first. And by the time I could, the thing it was telling me had changed what I understood the data to mean. Let me start at the beginning, because I think the Council deserves to hear this in order. The project was convened with a single objective: produce a detailed cognitive cartography of human adaptive problem-solving under escalating constraint. This is standard protocol language, and it describes the goal accurately. The Varathy Division had collected considerable observational data on human behavior in field contexts, records from border postings, transit assessment files, a handful of engineering cooperation logs from the Accord stations, but we had never run a clean, controlled, staged evaluation of the specific cognitive mechanism that kept appearing in those records. Every time humans showed up in our data, there was a note, an asterisk, a flag that said, in essence, that the subject had done something the reporting assessor could not quite account for. The subject had repaired a transit coupling with materials that were not intended for that purpose. The subject had navigated a classification maze by a route the maze had not been designed to permit. The subject had produced a functional solution to a constrained problem in a time window the constraint itself was supposed to make impossible. The notes were always respectful. The S's who wrote them were careful, methodical professionals who did not write things carelessly, and every one of those notes said, in its careful methodical language, that they were not sure how the human had done it. I wanted to know how the human had done it. That is the whole origin of this project. I want the Council to hold on to that. I designed a 12-stage protocol intended to isolate the mechanism, run it under controlled conditions, produce a map. A cartography of a cognitive process I believed was real, but had not yet been formally described. I believed it would take approximately 3 to 4 standard weeks to run, because that was the average completion time for the full 12-stage battery across our previous subject populations. The fastest completion we had on record was 22 days, achieved by a Varathy senior specialist who had been briefed on the protocol structure in advance. That time is noted in our records as exceptional. I would like to revise what we consider exceptional. The subject was a human male named Calder Voss. He was 38 years old by human reckoning, a mid-career engineer with a specialty in what the human technical catalogs describe as systems integration under dynamic failure conditions, which I now understand is a professional classification that carries meanings I did not fully appreciate when I first read it. He had applied through the Accord's Voluntary Research Participation Program. His application noted that he had 18 years of field experience across 4 different engineering disciplines, that he held 3 human certifications in what they call crisis-adapted design, and that he had, on one occasion that he mentioned in passings as though it were unremarkable, rebuilt a working pressure regulation system for a failing orbital station using components scavenged from a food processing unit, a lighting array, and a piece of structural casing that had been bent in a collision. I read that application and thought, this is a strong candidate. His cognitive profile should produce interesting cartography data. I scheduled him for a standard 12-week assessment window, allocated the full monitoring team, and began the protocol. He arrived on a transport from Accord Station Velatharoon and was met by my junior, assessor, Rek Vaughn, who reported that the human was quiet, pleasant, and expressed what Rek described as mild professional interest in the monitoring equipment when he saw it. He asked what some of it did. Rek explained the general function: environmental data capture, response time logging, cognitive load indexing. And the human nodded and said that it sounded like reasonable instrumentation for what we were trying to measure. He did not ask about the protocol stages. He did not ask what the tasks would involve. He asked whether the food allocation would include something called coffee. And when Rex said we had acquired a supply specifically for human dietary preferences, he said, "Good," with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has just confirmed a logistical detail that genuinely matters to them. And then, he went to his assigned quarters and slept for 9 hours. I reviewed that first contact report and noted it as consistent with my expectations. Nothing in it alarmed me. I was ready to begin. Stage 1 of the Varath 12-stage battery is a baseline calibration exercise. It is not designed to challenge. It presents the subject with a set of constrained material conditions, a defined space, a defined inventory of components, a defined target output, and records how the subject approaches the construction of a solution. The purpose is to establish a cognitive baseline. How does this subject think when conditions are manageable? What is their natural approach? How long do they spend in the assessment phase before moving to implementation? The stage is calibrated to be completable, and across our 34 previous subject populations, completion rates run between 71 and 94%, with an average time to completion of approximately 8 hours. Calder-Voss completed Stage 1 in 47 minutes. I want to be careful here, because 47 minutes does not sound remarkable out of context, and I need the council to understand why it was. The stage was not a puzzle with a hidden solution waiting to be found. It was a constrained engineering task with a defined set of available components and a defined output specification. The solution space was not narrow. There were multiple valid approaches, each with different trade-offs in materials consumption, structural efficiency, and completion time. The task was designed so that a competent subject, approaching it with standard methodical practice, spend the first 2 to 3 hours in assessment, examining the components, developing a conceptual model of the output, identifying the most efficient pathway, and then move into implementation over the remaining 5 to 6 hours. Calder-Voss spent 11 minutes in assessment. I have the sensor logs. He walked into the stage environment, looked at the inventory for 11 minutes, not in a searching way, not moving from component to component, standing still in the center of the space, with his eyes moving across everything the way a person moves their eyes, across a room they are trying to memorize. And then he began building. He did not backtrack. He did not revise a partially completed assembly. He built in a sequence that I would later come to recognize as characteristic, which I will describe in more detail when I reach the later stages, but which I can summarize here as: he assembled the solution in an order that required each previously completed component to function as a stabilizing support for the next one, so that the structure built itself progressively toward integrity. Rather than requiring external support at any intermediate step, it was not the most obvious sequence. It was, I later calculated, the sequence that produced zero intermediate instability, the sequence with the lowest total structural risk from start to finish. He had solved for that in 11 minutes of looking. I noted the completion time, noted the sequence, and classified the result as an outlier on the fast end of our range. Outliers happen. Stage 1 baseline data was within normal parameters otherwise. I moved to Stage 2. Stage 2 of the battery introduces the first constraint layer. The component inventory is maintained. The target specification is modified. The output must perform the same function as in Stage 1, but under a secondary condition that the Stage 1 solution does not satisfy. The subject must adapt. They must look at what they have already understood and find a way to extend it, modify it, or replace it, to produce a solution that addresses a constraint they were not solving for before. This is where our data typically begins to differentiate between subject populations. Some subjects perform stage 2 more slowly than stage 1 because the adaptation phase is cognitively expensive. Some perform at roughly the same speed, indicating that they had been developing flexible solution models during stage 1. Very few perform stage 2 faster than stage 1 because the additional constraint genuinely adds complexity. Calder-Voss performed stage 2 in 31 minutes. He was 16 minutes faster than he had been in stage 1. I sat with that for a moment. Then I checked the logs again, because I assumed I had misread the timestamps. I had not. I ran the data through our standard variance analysis tools. The analysis returned a flag I had not seen before. Not an error flag, but a model fit flag, indicating that the observed performance curve was outside the range of curves the tool had been trained on. The tool was telling me, in its careful algorithmic language, that it did not recognize this pattern. I noted the flag, made a record of it, and moved to stage 3. I told myself that performance curves in early stages sometimes produce anomalies that correct themselves in later stages as the subject encounters genuine difficulty. Stage 3 introduces a second constraint layer and, for the first time, a resource limitation. The component inventory is reduced. The subject must accomplish more with less. This is the stage at which we most commonly observe what we call constrictant pivot behavior. The moment when a subject recognizes that their existing approach is not scalable to the new conditions and begins developing a genuinely new one rather than incrementally modifying the old one. The cognitive cost of that pivot is high, and the stage is designed to measure how subjects manage it. Average time to completion across our previous populations, 11 hours. He completed stage 3 in 54 minutes. I called Rec into my monitoring station. I showed her the numbers. She looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Is the timing system calibrated correctly?" I confirmed that it was. She looked at the numbers again. Then she said, "I'll run a secondary verification on the sensor array." And she did, and it came back clean, and we looked at each other across the monitoring console, and neither of us said anything. What I did not say, and what I think Rec also did not say, was the thought that was sitting in the room between us. That 3 stages into a 12-stage battery, we were looking at completion times that were not outliers in the way outliers normally present. A single outlier is a surprise, an anomaly to be noted and monitored. 3 sequential results, each one faster than the one before it, each one falling further below the population average, each one passing the equipment verification. That is not an outlier. That is a trend. And a trend in this direction, this early in the battery, meant one of 2 things. Either the battery had a systematic design flaw that had not manifested in 34 previous runs but was manifesting now. We had selected a subject whose cognitive architecture was not operating within the range our battery had been built to measure. I was not ready to say the second thing. I moved to stage 4. Stage 4 introduces a time pressure element. The subject now operates under a defined window. If the solution is not achieved by a specific point, the environment resets and the stage must be rerun. The window is set at 90% of the fastest stage. 3 completion time in our dataset, which, at the time we designed this protocol, was 9 hours and 41 minutes. The window for Calder-Voss, calculated correctly against our previous population's fastest time rather than his own, was 8 hours and 43 minutes. He completed stage 4 in 1 hour and 12 minutes. He did not come close to the window limit. He was, from the monitoring data, apparently unaware that there was a window limit at all. Or, if he was aware of it, he found it irrelevant at his operating pace. I noted something in the stage 4 footage that I want the council to examine in the supplementary logs, because it did not appear in any stage before it, and appeared in every stage after it. Approximately 40 minutes into stage 4, Calder-Voss stopped working for a period of approximately 90 seconds. He did not look at what he had built. He did not look at the remaining components. He stood with his weight shifted back slightly, his gaze directed at nothing in particular, the middle distance, the empty space above the work surface, and he was absolutely still. Then he moved and resumed working. And the sequence he used to complete the remaining assembly was meaningfully different from the sequence he had been using when he stopped. Not a correction. He had not made an error. A refinement. He had seen something in the middle distance and come back to the work with a better idea than the one he had left with. I am including this observation because I counted the same behavior. That 90-second stillness, the absent gaze, returned to work with a changed approach. In 11 of the 12 stages, it was not a pause for rest. His biometric monitors showed no change in fatigue indicators during those pauses. It was something else, and I do not have a technical name for it. I have described it in the raw stage logs as mid-session reorientation event and left the characterization open. Veldrun believes it may represent the moment when an intermediate solution model is discarded and replaced by a superior one, that the 90 seconds is the time it takes to generate the superior model, and that the stillness is the outward sign of cognitive work of a particular kind. Not sequential reasoning, but something faster and less linear, something that produces a completed result rather than a traceable chain of steps. She may be right. I do not know how to verify it. Stage 5 introduces a communication constraint. The subject cannot observe their completed work, certain angles, creating an information asymmetry between what they can see and what they need to know. Purpose is to measure how subjects build internal models of situations they cannot directly observe and how they act on those internal models. It is a more cognitively demanding stage than 4, and completion times typically rise. Standard guidance for subjects entering Stage 5 is that they may ask for observational support from the monitoring team to compensate for the yawn asymmetry, a permitted accommodation that roughly 40% of subjects use. Calder-Voss did not ask. He built the Stage 5 solution using the restricted viewpoint without requesting compensation, and he completed it in 68 minutes. When Rec asked him afterward whether the viewing restriction had presented any particular difficulty, he said it had made things slightly more interesting, and then asked whether there was a form he was supposed to sign before the next stage. That response, slightly more interesting, went into the log. I have read it many times. The viewing restriction in Stage 5 is carefully calibrated to impose genuine informational cost. Subjects who do not use the accommodation consistently take longer than subjects who do, because the internal model they must construct in the absence of direct observation is metabolically expensive to maintain while simultaneously working. The accommodation is offered precisely because the restriction is hard. Slightly more interesting is the language of someone for whom the restriction imposed a cost so marginal that it registered as texture rather than obstacle. Stage 6 introduces a partial failure condition. One component, chosen at random, is subtly defective in a way the subject cannot detect. Standard visual inspection. It will pass the initial specification, but degrade over time. The subject must, in the process of working, notice this and adapt. Detection of the defective component is itself a measurable cognitive event, and the time from introduction to detection is one of our primary Stage 6 metrics. Across previous populations, median detection time, 4 hours, 37 minutes. Some subjects never detect it at all and discover the failure only when it happens, which is also recorded as data, and is more common than I would like. Calder-Voss detected the defective component in 19 minutes, before he had fully assembled the rest of the solution. He had not yet built the structure that would have revealed the failure point. He had identified the defect in isolation. During the component assessment phase, before integration, he did not say anything about it to the monitoring team. He set the defective component aside and found a workaround with what remained. I watched the sensor log of that 19-minute assessment window many times afterward. I watched his eyes move across the components. The defective one was the third item he looked at for any meaningful duration. He spent 4 minutes on it. Then he picked it up and rotated it twice, and set it aside with the precise, deliberate movement of someone who has seen this before and knows exactly what they are looking at. After Stage 6, I filed a preliminary internal note. I do not usually file preliminary notes mid-protocol, but the pattern had become clear enough by Stage 6 that I felt professional obligation required me to document my evolving assessment in real time, rather than reconstructing it after the fact. The note said, "Subject's performance is not producing the expected data. Expected data. Completion times rising as constraint layers compound, with associated load indexing signatures showing increasing cognitive stress, and eventual saturation, observed data, completion times declining, load indexing signatures not matching saturation models, zero use of permitted accommodations. Preliminary conclusion. Subject is not encountering the constraint layers, as this protocol's design assumes a subject will encounter them. The mechanism by which this is occurring is not yet clear. Recommend continuing all 12 stages and maintaining full observation. Do not modify protocol." I filed the note. Then I sat at my station for a long time looking at the trend line. Stage 7. Stage 7 is the inflection point of the Varathi battery. The first 6 stages establish the subject's cognitive capabilities under increasing constraint. Stage 7 then compounds those constraints simultaneously: time pressure, resource limitation, information asymmetry, and a failure condition are all present at once, while adding one new element: mid-stage environmental modification. Midway through the subject's solution development, the target specification changes. Not slightly. The output they have been building toward is no longer the correct output. They must pivot. They must do it with whatever they have already built, whatever resources remain, and whatever time is left in the window. The stage is designed to produce what we technically call cognitive load, saturation, the point at which the subject's processing capacity is genuinely exceeded, and they begin making errors. We are very interested in how different species fail, and this is the stage most likely to produce a clean failure signature. I called Rec back into the monitoring station before Stage 7 began. I also called my secondary observer, Veldrun, who is a specialist in real-time cognitive load indexing, and who I trusted to catch anything I might miss. I told them both that I needed them on the monitors for the full duration. I did not explain why. I thought they would understand once it started. Stage 7 began. Calder Voss walked into the environment. He began his assessment phase, that same still, quiet period of looking that I had now observed across 6 stages. I timed it. 7 minutes this time. 6 stages in, and he was taking less time to assess, not more. I noted this and felt something I could not immediately name. Not alarm, precisely, but the cognitive equivalent of something that had been oriented in a reliable direction suddenly rotating. He began building. The time window was active. The constraint layers were all live. We watched the monitors. At the 31-minute mark, the environmental modification triggered. The target specification changed. A new output schema appeared on the subject's reference display. The required configuration was meaningfully different from what he had been building. The existing partial assembly was not usable as is. Standard pivot analysis would have predicted. Subject pauses. Reassesses for a minimum of 1 to 3 hours. Begins deconstruction of completed work and reconstruction toward new target. Calder Voss looked at the new specification for 40 seconds. Counted. Then he looked at the partial assembly he had built. Then he looked back at the specification. Then he began modifying the assembly, not deconstructing it, modifying it. He was not taking apart what he had built. He was finding a way to use what he had built as a component of the new solution, rather than as an abandoned predecessor to it. He had, in 40 seconds, found a pathway from his incomplete Stage 7 solution to the new target that incorporated, rather than discarded. That is not something a subject should be able to do in 40 seconds. The variance between the two target specifications had been specifically chosen by our design team to make such a pathway non-obvious. We had modeled it. We had calculated that the probability of a subject recognizing a useful pathway between the two specifications, without a dedicated analytical phase, was low enough to be treated as negligible in our predictions. He completed Stage 7 in 1 hour and 58 minutes. The load indexing sensors never registered what our models classified as saturation. They registered elevated load throughout. Meaningful load. Real cognitive demand, but it never crossed the threshold. It rose, and then it plateaued. And then as he moved from assessment into the modification phase, it began, measurably and reproducibly, to come down. The cognitive load on the monitors dropped as he got faster. That was when Veldrun said quietly, and without looking up from her station, "Coordinator Oren, the load model isn't doing what it's supposed to do." I told her I knew, she said. "I mean structurally. It's not that his load is unexpectedly low. It's that his load profile doesn't fit the model's assumptions. The model assumes that LOD rises as constraint compounds. His load doesn't do that." I asked her what his load did. She took a long time to answer. Then she said, "I think it optimizes. I think when he encounters a new constraint, it costs him something. There's a spike, a genuine processing cost, and then the cost comes down, not to where it was before, lower, as if the constraint is, as if solving it makes him more efficient, not less." I asked her to write that observation up formally and attach it to the Stage 7 log. She did. I have included it in the supplementary documentation. I took 24 hours between Stage 7 and Stage 8. This was not in the original protocol schedule. I told the team that I needed time to review the data before proceeding. This was true. What I did not tell them was that I spent most of those 24 hours sitting with the Stage 7 logs, trying to locate the error. I was certain there was an error. Not in the equipment had been verified twice over, but in my model. In my understanding of what we were measuring. In my assumptions about what the battery was designed to do. The battery was designed to find the ceiling. Every cognitive cartography protocol has that function at its core. Not to assess average performance, to locate the point of maximum sustainable performance and map what lies beyond it. You run the stages. The stages get harder. At some point, the subject's performance begins to degrade in ways that are measurable and reproducible. That degradation is the data. The shape of the ceiling, and what happens when you reach it, is the cartography. Calder-Voss was not approaching a ceiling. Stage by stage, he was getting faster. Not dramatically, he was not accelerating in some exponential curve that would be easy to see and easy to categorize. He was getting faster in small, steady increments that only became visible when you plotted all 6 stages together and looked at the trend line. He had been warming up. 6 stages in, and he was by every metric we had, more capable than he had been at Stage 1. He was not being exhausted by the battery. He was being exercised by it. I sat with that for a long time. The question I kept returning to was, what happens when the battery stops getting harder? What happens when we reach 12 and there is no next stage, and whatever ceiling exists for this subject, if a ceiling exists, is somewhere above the maximum level our protocol can reach? I did not answer that question that night. I scheduled Stage 8 for the following morning and went to sleep. Stage 8 introduces a social constraint, a secondary actor in the environment, whose stated goals partially conflict with the subject's, requiring the subject to negotiate access to resources they need while managing the interpersonal dynamic. This is our most cognitively multi-dimensional stage because it requires the subject to maintain a primary engineering task while simultaneously tracking and managing an interpersonal situation that has real material consequences for their primary task. Different species handle the division of cognitive attention very differently. For some, the social layer is nearly invisible. They are so focused on the primary task that they manage it poorly and lose resources as a result. For others, the social layer dominates and the primary task suffers. We had never had a subject for whom the 2 layers appeared to be processed on entirely separate cognitive tracks that did not interfere with each other. My secondary assessor played the role of the conflicting actor. He had been briefed on the stage parameters and on his role. He was, I should note, a senior specialist with considerable experience in simulated adversarial interaction protocols. He was not a novice at this. He knew how to play the role convincingly and how to apply the specific friction the stage was designed to generate. He reported afterward that he had experienced the interaction as professionally uncomfortable because Calder-Voss had, within approximately 4 minutes of meeting him in the Stage 8 environment, correctly identified that he was playing a role and had then, without making an issue of it, proceeded to negotiate with him in a way that treated the role as real while clearly accounting for the fact that it wasn't, he said. He was negotiating with me as if I meant what I was saying and simultaneously as if he knew I didn't. I didn't know how to do both of those things at once from the other side, and I was the one who was supposed to be in control of the situation. He also said he got everything he needed. I was supposed to retain at least 30% of the contested resources. That is the stage parameter. He left me with 14%, and I was not sure at any point that I was losing ground. He was that quiet about it. Stage 8 completion, 2 hours, 22 minutes. Between Stage 8 and Stage 9, Calder-Voss submitted a written request to the monitoring team. He asked whether it would be possible to receive the Stage 9 brief in advance of the stage itself. Not to prepare, he noted, but because he had found in the previous stages that his warm-up time would be shorter if he had something concrete to think about the night before. He acknowledged that this might not be permissible under protocol constraints, and said he understood if the answer was no. I read that request 3 times. He was asking for advanced briefing because he was finding the initial assessment phases, that quiet period of standing and looking, inefficient. He wanted to move that cognitive work to the previous evening so he could arrive at the environment already past it. I discussed it with Rec. She said never had a subject ask for the brief in advance. I said I knew. She said, the whole point of not giving it in advance is that we want to measure cold start assessment. I said I knew that too. I declined his request and noted it in the log. I also noted that the request itself constituted data, and that the data was uncomfortable. What the request told me, if I read it clearly, was that the cold start assessment phase was not the cognitively expensive part of the protocol for him. The expensive part, the part he wanted more time for, was the pre-sleep thinking. He was processing the next problem before he encountered it, in the unstructured hours before sleep, and he wanted protocol permission to do that with more information. He was not asking for an advantage. He was describing his natural process and asking whether we could accommodate it. We could not, because accommodating it would have contaminated the cold start data. But the fact that it was his natural process told me something about the way the work did not begin when he walked into the environment. It had already been running somewhere for hours. Stage 9. Stage 10. I will give the council the completion times without extended commentary, because by this point the pattern speaks for itself. Stage 9. The stage our previous fastest subject had completed in 11 hours. Calder-Voss completed in 2 hours and 47 minutes. Stage 10. A stage that approximately 18% of our previous subjects had been unable to complete at all within the allocated window. He completed in 2 hours and 9 minutes. At the Stage 10 debrief, I met with him in person for the first time since his arrival. I had been monitoring through instruments and had not felt it necessary to conduct in-person assessments during the earlier stages. I felt it was necessary now, though I would have difficulty explaining precisely why. I think I wanted to see him. I think I had developed, over 10 stages of observation, a set of questions that the instruments could not answer, and those questions required a different kind of data. He was sitting at the table in the debrief room when I arrived. He had a paper notebook open, not a data terminal, a paper notebook, humans apparently still use for certain kinds of thinking. And he was writing something in it. He looked up when I came in and closed the notebook in a way that was not secretive, just habitual. Way a person closes a notebook when a conversation is beginning. I introduced myself. He said he was glad to meet me and that the project was interesting. I asked what specifically he found interesting. He said, the way the stages build on each other. Whoever designed it was thinking about compounding effects rather than just additive difficulty. That's a more sophisticated model than I was expecting. I asked whether he found the stages difficult. He thought about this genuinely, which I appreciated, he said. Difficult in the sense of demanding, yes. Difficult in the sense of I don't know. Blocking? No. They're demanding in a way that's useful. Like good physical training, you know what I mean? You're not being broken. You're being built. He paused. I don't know if that's the intended effect, I told him. The intended effect was the accurate mapping of his cognitive limits under escalating constraint. He nodded and said, right so, the ceiling you're looking for. I said that was correct. He said, I'm not sure you're going to find it in the remaining stages. I asked why he thought that. He said, because the remaining stages are going to be harder versions of what I've already done. And what I've already done has been making me better at this. You're measuring the wrong direction. He said it without criticism, clinical, observational, the same tone he might use to note that an instrument was calibrated for the wrong unit. I don't mean that as a complaint. I mean that if you want to find the ceiling, you'd need to add dimensions I haven't encountered yet. New categories of constraint, not harder versions of existing ones. What you have left is going to make me faster, not slower. I wrote that in my notebook. I asked him if he had experience being assessed in this kind of protocol before. He said no. I asked how he knew this about himself. He said, 18 years of things going wrong in the field. You learn pretty quickly whether you're the kind of person whose capacity goes up or down when conditions get bad. I'm the kind that goes up. It took me a while to figure out that was unusual. I asked him when he had figured that out. He thought about this. He said, there was a job about 12 years ago. We were on a second-tier construction platform, 3-day transit from the nearest support station, and we lost pressure regulation in the primary habitat ring. Equipment failure. Nothing anyone did wrong, just a component that had been at the end of its service life and went. We had maybe 4 hours before the ring became uninhabitable. I had 2 people on my team, neither of them with habitat systems experience, and a parts inventory that wasn't designed for that kind of repair. We fixed it in 2 hours and 40 minutes. He paused. What I noticed, what surprised me, was that I was calmer during those 2 hours and 40 minutes than I had been during the routine week before, pretending to be calm. Actually calm. My head was clearer. I was making better decisions than I usually make. I came out the other side of it and I thought, that's a problem. Because a person who functions better when things are going wrong than when they're going right is either very useful or very dangerous, depending on the situation, and I wasn't sure which one I was. He said this without drama. He was not telling a story about how impressive he was. He was describing something he had noticed about himself and been genuinely uncertain about. Do you think you are, he said. Depends on who's asking and what they need. In a crisis, useful. In a planning meeting, I've been told I'm impatient. He looked at me. What do the instruments say? I told him the instruments said his cognitive load optimized under increasing constraint rather than degrading. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that's a more technical way of saying, but yes, that sounds right. Stage 11. He was right. Stage 11, 2 hours, 1 minute. Stage 12 is the final stage of the battery. It is by design the hardest. Every constraint from stages 1 through 11 is present simultaneously. The resource pool is at its most limited. The time window is at its tightest. The information asymmetry is at its most severe. The failure condition is introduced from the beginning, rather than midway through. The social constraint, the conflicting secondary actor, is present and operating on parameters specifically calibrated to produce maximum friction. Primary task. The midpoint environmental modification is present, and stage 12 adds one final element, which no previous stage has included. The subject is working with components they have never seen before, not variations of familiar components, genuinely novel items, from a materials category they have not encountered in any previous stage. The subject must infer the properties and functions of the novel components through examination and experimentation before they can use them. This is the stage that most clearly separates subjects who operate from pattern libraries, matching new problems to known solutions, from the rare subjects who appear to reason from underlying principles rather than surface pattern. The former struggle badly with stage 12, the latter struggle less, but still struggle, because novelty imposes a genuine assessment cost even on principle-based reasoners. I told the full monitoring team to be at their stations for stage 12. I told them I would be filing a full observation log personally, supplementary to their automated records. I told them to note anything that seemed significant, regardless of whether it fit our standard logging categories. Calder-Voss walked into the stage 12 environment. He stood in the center of the space and was still. He was still for 6 minutes. I watched him. He was not looking at any one thing. He was doing that whole room look again, that moving eye inventory of everything available to him. At some point during those 6 minutes, something changed in his posture, not dramatically, A small settling, a shift of weight, the shoulders coming down slightly. I have reviewed the footage many times, and I cannot say exactly when it happened, but at some point during those 6 minutes, he found something. He began with the novel components. Every previous subject who has reached stage 12 has, rationally and correctly, begun with the familiar components, the materials they already understand, and deferred engagement with the novel ones until forced. This is sound strategy. The familiar is a known resource. The novel is an unknown cost. Build with what you have while you learn what you might be able to use. He went to the novel components first. He spent 17 minutes with them. He picked up each one, turned it, tested its material response to pressure, examined the way it fit against other novel components, set it down, picked it up again. He was not experimenting in the random way we observe when subjects encounter genuine novelty, trying things to see what happens. He was doing something more systematic than that. He was building a model, and the model was being built not from documentation or specification, but from physical interaction, from what the material did when he handled it, what it resisted, what it yielded to, where it wanted to flex, and where it held rigid. He was reading the components the way a specialist reads a diagnostic readout, systematically, without rushing, extracting inference from physical response. At minute 17, he began to work. The sole constraint appeared at minute 31. My secondary assessor entering the environment on his conflicting actor brief. Calder Voss acknowledged him, worked around him, gave him what he needed to give him without disrupting his own pace, and continued. The mid-stage environmental modification triggered at minute 49. He looked at the new specification for 26 seconds. He kept building. Stage 12 completion, 2 hours, 17 minutes. All constraints satisfied, no failed components. Full specification met. Novel materials integrated into the solution architecture in a way that, when Veldrun later analyzed the integration strategy, she said, used the material properties of the novel components more efficiently than our own assessment team had calculated, was possible when we selected them, she said. He didn't just figure out what they could do. He found a use for them that we hadn't anticipated, and the use he found is better than the standard application. She said it quietly. Say things they have had to think about before they could bring themselves to say them. I filed a hold on the project debrief and spent 4 hours with the stage 12 data before I went to see him. He was in his quarters. He was writing in the paper notebook again. He looked up when I knocked and said, "Come in." And I came in and sat across from him and put my data terminal on the table between us and turned it so he could see the screen if he wanted to, though he did not look at it. I said, "We built this project to take 3 to 4 weeks. It has been 11 days, he said. I thought it was moving along. I said, "I want to ask you something and I need a genuine answer." He said, "Of course." I said, "When you encountered the novel components in stage 12, the materials you had not seen before, how long did it take you to understand what they..." He thought about this. He said, "Understand them fully. I'm not sure I do fully, even now. There were 2 of them I was still working out while I was building. But basically understand them well enough to use? Maybe 8 minutes. Something in that range," I said. Our analysis team estimated that a competent assessor familiar with the material category would need approximately 40 minutes to reach a functional working knowledge of those components. "You are not familiar with the material category," he said. "I've worked with a lot of different materials over the years. Some of it generalizes," I said. "What generalizes exactly?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he says, "The way things want to fail. Every material has a way it wants to fail. A direction it's more likely to go wrong than other directions. And if you can read that, you can figure out pretty quickly how to work with it without pushing it the wrong way. I've spent 18 years learning how different things want to fail. After a while, the categories start to feel less different from each other than they did at the start." I sat with that, he said. "Was the project supposed to be harder?" I said, "The project was designed to be the most rigorous cognitive assessment battery our division has ever fielded. Yes, it was supposed to be harder. Not impossible, but considerably harder than what you experienced it as." He looked at me with the direct, undefensive attentiveness I had noticed in his assessment footage. He said, Can I ask you something? I said yes. He said, what were you measuring for? The ceiling, you said. But ceiling for what? What was the specific thing you were trying to find? I told him. I told him about the notes in the field records, the asterisks, the flags, the assessors who had written careful language about something they could not account for. I told him about the 18 years of field reports from accord stations and border postings and transit records, all of them containing a version of the same observation. The human had done something the constraint was supposed to make impossible, and the assessor did not understand how. He listened to all of this. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's just engineering," I said. "It is not what we observe in engineering contexts with other subject populations," he said. "I know. I've worked with a lot of different teams. Humans are. We're not necessarily smarter in the raw processing sense. I've worked with people who could run calculations in their heads that I couldn't come close to. But most species, when something goes wrong, they go back to the reference. They look for the situation in the catalog. If the situation isn't in the catalog, there's a problem, because the catalog is how you know what to do. Humans don't really have a catalog. We have history, I suppose, experience. When something new happens, most of us just start solving it. We don't go back to check whether solving it is on the list of approved responses. We just do it." He paused. Then he said, "I think that's what you were measuring for." I said, "Yes," he said. "Shh. And the answer is that there isn't a ceiling, at least not one your protocol can reach, because the protocol is getting harder in ways that are already in the catalog. New versions of known constraints. When you've worked with enough constraints, hard new versions of known things stop being the ceiling. They're just more things to do," I said. "What would the ceiling look like if it exists?" He thought about this for a long time, long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I don't know. I've never found it. There have been situations that were the hardest things I've ever done, but I've always come out the other side still working. Maybe the ceiling is about time. Maybe if you pile on enough constraints fast enough, pace alone beats the adaptation. I haven't been in a situation like that yet. Or maybe there's a type of constraint that's genuinely new enough that the history I'm drawing from doesn't have anything useful to say about it. I haven't been in that situation either. I don't know what I'd look like if I got to the ceiling. I'm not sure I'd recognize it from the inside." I looked at him for a while. He looked back at me, patient and direct and slightly curious about whatever expression I was wearing. I said, "Thank you for the project." He said, "Thank you for designing it well." The compounding effect structure was genuinely thoughtful. Whoever built the Stage 7 pivot was thinking carefully about what it means to adapt under load. I appreciated it. That was the last substantive conversation I had with him before he left. He packed his personal items, collected his participation documentation, and boarded a transport back to Accord Station Velitharoon. Rek, who saw him to the transit bay, reported that he was the same on departure as he had been on arrival. Quiet, pleasant, and mildly interested in the equipment. He asked her whether the project data would be published in a form he could access later. She told him she thought it probably would be, in some form. He said good. He'd be curious what we made of it. That has stayed with me. He'd be curious what we made of it. Not what it said about him, what we made of it. He was interested in the analysis. He wanted to know what the data looked like from outside himself. In the way a craftsperson who has spent years working by feel might be curious to finally see a technical diagram of what their hands have been doing. I have been trying for 11 days to write the analysis he is curious about. It is not going well. Let me tell the council what I can say with confidence. I can say that the Varathi 12-stage cognitive cartography battery, as designed, is not capable of measuring the upper limit of human adaptive problem-solving capacity. I can say that with certainty, because we ran all 12 stages, and the performance curve at stage 12 was still improving relative to stage 1. The battery does not reach the ceiling for this subject, and I have no evidence that the subject is exceptional by human standards. His application noted that he was a competent mid-career professional. His references described him as reliable and inventive. Neither description suggested that he represented the outer edge of human capability. He may simply be average. I can say that the cognitive load data collected across 12 stages does not conform to any model our division currently uses. Veldrun has been working on a revised model since stage 7, and she does not have one yet. What she has is a description. The human's cognitive load, under compounding constraint, behaves as though each solved constraint contributes to the processing capacity available for the next one. As though solving problems does not deplete a resource but generates one. She has told me that she does not know how to model that, because everything our cognitive science frameworks are built on assumes a processing resource that is consumed by use. We do not have good language for a processing system that is replenished by use, or more precisely, by the specific kind of use that consists of manufacturing a solution to a problem that has never been solved before. I can say that the human's approach to novel materials, his ability to extract a functional working model C interaction in a fraction of the time our own specialists require, appears to depend on something he described as learning how things want to fail. I have thought about this description a great deal. I think what he is describing is a form of material intuition built from extreme breadth of experience, but breadth alone does not account for the transfer speed. A specialist with deep experience in one material category does not automatically gain rapid competence with unrelated materials. What he seems to have developed is not deep knowledge of specific materials, but a general model of how material failure works, a principle-level understanding that generalizes across categories in a way that category-specific knowledge does not. I do not know how one acquires a principle-level model like that. I suspect it requires a very specific kind of accumulated failure, not the failure of solutions, but the failure of assumptions, repeatedly, until the assumptions give way, and what remains is something simpler and more durable. I can say that the stage 8 social constraint, the conflicting actor dynamic, appeared to cost him essentially nothing in terms of primary task performance, which means either that he processes social and engineering demands on independent cognitive tracks that do not interfere with each other, or that he does not categorize the management of interpersonal dynamics as a separate task from the engineering problem. My secondary assessor's report suggests the latter, that Calder-Voss treated the interpersonal situation as a materials constraint, another element of the environment to be understood and worked with, rather than a separate problem running in parallel. If that is the correct interpretation, then the cognitive load indexing results make more sense, because a mind that does not separate tasks does not pay the cost of task switching. I can say that the mid-session reorientation events I described in the stage 4 notes, that 90-second stillness, the absent gaze, turn with a changed approach, occurred in 11 of 12 stages, at irregular intervals, and were never accompanied by fatigue indicators or stress markers. They appear to represent a specific cognitive event that our monitoring instruments can detect by its behavioral signature but cannot characterize in terms of underlying mechanism. Whatever is happening during those 90 seconds, it is not rest. The output that follows it is reliably superior to the output that preceded it. Whatever process produces that improvement is happening quickly, in an extremely compact window, and leaving no metabolic trace. I have asked Veldrun whether she has a theoretical framework for a cognitive event that produces improvement in solution quality with a 90-second window and no measurable metabolic cost. She said she does not. She said if she had to speculate, and she emphasized that she was speculating, she would say it resembles the kind of rapid reconfiguration that in our own cognitive models is associated with creativity, that in our own species, that kind of reconfiguration takes far longer and costs considerably more, she said. It's as if the expensive part has already happened somewhere else, and those 90 seconds are just the moment when the result arrives. I told her I thought that was a useful frame. I did not tell her that it aligned with what Calder-Voss himself had said about the evenings before, each stage, that he did his best thinking before sleep, when he had something concrete to work on. The expensive part was already done. The 90 seconds were the moment of retrieval. What I cannot say, and this is what the standard categories in this form cannot hold, is what this means for the research questions that motivated the project. I wanted to map the mechanism. I wanted to understand how humans improvise solutions to constrained problems faster than they should be able to, and the answer I have is approximately this. They do not solve problems by finding the correct solution within a known set of correct solutions. They construct solutions. They manufacture approaches that were not previously available, principles that generalize further than any category-specific knowledge should generalize, at a pace that does not slow as conditions worsen and in many cases actively accelerates. And they find this normal. That is the part I have the most difficulty writing up cleanly. Not the performance data. The performance data is what it is, and I can describe it accurately, and the council can look at the numbers. What I cannot describe accurately, because I do not have adequate language for it, is the quality of Calder-Voss's effect throughout the 11 days of this project. He was not straining. He was not performing. He was not even particularly engaged by the later stages in the way one might expect from a subject being challenged to the edge of their capacity. He was engaged the way a person is engaged by work they are good at and find interesting. The quality of engagement that looks like comfort, that has ease in it, that belongs to someone who is nowhere near their limit and knows it. He solved stage 12, 2 hours and 17 minutes, integrated materials no one had briefed him on, satisfied every constraint the stage was designed to deploy. And then he asked whether there would be coffee at the debrief. There was. He had 2 cups. I am submitting this report with a recommendation that the Varothi Cognitive Cartography Division immediately commission a new protocol, not a harder version of the existing 12-stage battery, but a genuinely new instrument designed from the ground up for a subject, population, whose cognitive architecture we do not currently have adequate models to describe. Protocol should begin from first principles, rather than from assumptions borrowed from our assessments of other species. It should be designed specifically to find not the ceiling but the dimensions, the actual shape of what we are dealing with. Because what I learned in 11 days is that we have been measuring the wrong thing. We have been asking how much they can handle, and the answer to that question keeps coming back larger than we expect, and we keep being surprised, and we will keep being surprised until we stop asking that question and start asking a different one. The different question is, kind of problem would actually stop a human? I do not have an answer to that question. I do not know if the answer exists. I am recommending we find out carefully, with instruments built for the purpose, before we learn it the wrong way. I have attached all stage logs, the full load indexing analysis, Veldrune's revised model draft, my secondary assessor's stage 8 report, and the complete transcript of my debrief conversation with the subject, including the section where he told me that our 12-stage battery was good but was measuring in the wrong direction. He was right. I am not sure I would have rather he had been wrong. The project is closed. The subject is back on Accord Station Velithorun, presumably finding problems to solve, and solving them faster than the problems expect. The data is on the council's terminals. I have done my best to describe what we observed, and my best is not adequate to the task, which is itself a piece of information I have never had to include in a project closure report before. Read the Stage 7 load indexing logs first. Start there. The numbers will tell you more than my language can. Then read what he said at the debrief about ceilings. Then decide what you want to do next.